Before we move on to Authority Member Rossi, I would like to ask you, as now that you've been described as the financial expert, that's your role, your own authority member. There are two questions I still would like to have answered. One is the question of, as Commissioner, as Dan Richmond indicated, we are now completing, he said, and he described how the completion of the initial operating segment, which will be in 10 years from now, 2022. And again, that means then the private sector gets involved. I would like to know, were there discussions or are there ongoing discussions to involve the private sector so we can transfer some of this risk? The ridership numbers to me mean less if we're the only group that has skin in the game. It's our money, so if it goes down and the ridership numbers don't, it's the public. If we have someone else in the game as a partner, and they have some risk in this also, I would tell you I would have a lot more faith in the ridership numbers because they're at risk too. And so, and that may not be the important argument, and it may not be that you can, and I understand that. I am not a builder of high-speed rail. I am just trying to do diligence as a legislator who's going to sit on a budget committee and appropriate money, and I want to, following that question, an answer to Senator Simitian's, are we going to hear a little bit more about who's going to pay for this? Are you going to tell us right now how much you think the federal government's going to, are they ultimately going to, we heard up to 70% of this? That's about $3.5 billion a year, I would assume, over the next 20 years. Where is this money coming from? We need to hear that to begin that discussion. Now, you may not be able to tell us that, but we're going to be thinking it, and so we need to begin to discuss it. If that's not the discussion that we should be having, that's what our constituents are telling us, the ones that want this, but they keep asking, where's it coming from? Yeah, you're right. We just need to be real clear about this, and I think you've done a great job in laying it out. As I pointed out before, we're more transparent. You've laid out, you've listened. This is a draft plan, but there are some very important issues around ridership and where we start and flexibility, when we start, and where the money's coming from, that we need to start that discussion. We couldn't start that discussion before because we didn't believe in the business plan. Now we believe in the business plan. We need to start that in the draft. We need to start that discussion. So I applaud you, as others have, for raising the bar, giving us something. But now we have to ask some very tough questions.
You know, Senator, I thought following Dan Richard was like being the last guy in line behind the elephants in a parade. I'm not so sure it's not both of you. But the fact is that I'll be happy to try and talk about the financing aspects of this and some of the issues raised. First of all, I think that as you look at the numbers, and I think what I'll do is use as a reference this document, if that's okay. This is the white paper. And as you look at the white paper, it talks about the fact that what's the impact on the budget if we do this, the state budget. The impact on the state budget will be the $9 billion that's in the plan. If you look at this plan, we don't ask for anything more than $9 billion from the state. Now, the cost of paying the interest is not in this plan, but has never been intended to be in this plan. When you look at the private sector participation, they participate in our plan at 3 years into the operation of the IOS for a tune of $11 billion. So if you look at, you've got 9 plus 12 plus 3 is 12 plus 11, which would be identifiable numbers as we sit today. The remaining financing, as you've said, we look to the federal government for grants. As you look through the first operating segment, the iOS, the actual grants required, the way I run the numbers, end up to be about $1.7 billion a year. And the way I run those numbers is, as Dan took you through a set of numbers, I'll take you through a set. If you look at $54 billion as the cost to get through Beta Basin, and you get $9 billion in Cal bonds, that leaves you $45 billion. You take out $3 billion Fed, that gets you to $42 billion. You take out $11 billion for concessions, that gets you to $31 billion. And speaking to Senator Gaines' issues of when and where, and your issue, the private sector gets involved, if in fact our numbers are reasonable, what will happen is that instead of using the 11% discount rate we have used, we will actually sell these for what they approximately sell for today, which is anywhere between 7 and 8, which adds another $5 billion to that concession number, which means you're looking at $26 billion to get to Beta Basin. That doesn't answer your question of where you get the 26. We're looking at it from the feds. If I look at it from the feds at 15 years, it's $1,733 million a year. And that's how I look at those numbers, and that's where I would have those discussions. The issue as to where the private sector plays seems to me that since 2004, there have been 16 transactions totaling approximately $56 billion for these types of sales and investments, most of them happening between 2006 and 2010 during a very tough time in the international world. I think it's pretty clear that if, in fact, you build this and there is ridership, that there will not be any difficulty in selling that concession contract. And the nice thing about the concession contract is it's for 30 years. These assets are 100 years long. So you could sell it 30 years again, and you can sell it 30 years again after that, should you desire. Now, if you ask me what those subsequent 30 years are worth, and the subsequent 30 years after that, it becomes very difficult when you talk about what the opportunity costs are of the money and what the buying power is. But if you kept them $20, $10, you would continue to be looking at anywhere in the neighborhood of $11 to $12 billion, and then you can add the inflation rate, however you like to do that. So the issue of the private sector, if in fact it's built and we hit our numbers, it's not going to be a major problem, as I said.
Speak up, please.
I'm sorry. There are, as I said, there have been 16 transactions during that period of time, totaling $56 billion. And we can have that conversation. The issue of having the private sector as an investor coming in earlier, from my perspective, and looking at the capital markets and the markets in general for this type of transaction, doesn't happen. The 2 times it was tried failed. And the 3rd time it was tried, which was with Brazil, have not been able to get the private sector interested. And the reason isn't because of whether or not they believe the ridership models. The reason is that because as you look at these, we're talking about operating companies. These are not investment companies in the way we generally use the term. So an operating company is not going to invest in infrastructure because they won't get their money back. If you, as Tom said, and he said profit, and it's really net operating profit. As you look at 12 of the 13, and I don't look at China because I can't figure out the numbers on China, so I'm just going to tell you that. But when you look at the other 12, they all have operating profit. That's what operating companies buy when they buy concessions in rails. So if you can't recover your entire investment because of the infrastructure costs, you're not going to get in at an early stage. The math just doesn't work for a private sector investor for that piece. What they're going to invest in, and it's an interesting term that they use, state-of-the-art term for the business, but as a banker I'll tell you, it's a purchase. It's a concession contract. They're not buying equity in the operation. They are buying the rights to revenues in operating the organization. So that's the kind of conversations we can have about those issues.
First 3 years at least, the state accepts the risk of operations.
Through the chair.
Yeah. Senator Simitian.
Thank you. Mr. Rice, does that mean that you do not anticipate that the authority will need to come back and ask for another bond issuance in order to build out the project from the state of California?
Yes.
Do all the members of the authority who are here today agree with that?
Yeah.
As presently proposed, that's correct.
I want to get back.
Well, let me just finish that, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief.
Certainly.
I think if I were persuaded we could have a $100 billion project for a $10 billion investment by the state of California, I'd probably take that deal. The reason I'm reticent is I'm not yet persuaded that we can have a $100 billion project for $10 billion in state investment. And the issue that continues to weigh on me is the issue that Senator Lowenthal has raised, which is who bears that risk. Because I'll tell you quite frankly, the thing I worry about is that 2, 5, or 10 years from now, the authority will be back with another $10 billion bond request for the state of California. And that's a serious concern on my part as we go forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Senator Gaines.
Yeah, I want to echo what Senator Simitian just said. That the question is the risk borne by the private sector, or is it borne by the taxpayer? And I think there's a model out there where the risk can be borne by the private sector. We have up to $9 billion of taxpayer money that's been approved through the initiative. I think we ought to be talking to the private sector on how to build the project with them bearing 100% of the burden outside the $9 billion investment by California taxpayers. And I think that's the conversation we ought to be having. And I think that model is available out there based on some of the information that I'm gathering. I'm concerned exactly as Senator Simitian just indicated that we could potentially create a black hole for money where we have an entity that is not profitable and we have this coming back in our lap in years in the future asking for additional money. I think the model has to be a profitable one. I know there are people in the private sector that would take on this project that would bear the risk with a $9 billion investment by the state of California taxpayers. And why are we not looking at that? I don't think we have to take the federal money. I think we can look at the high profit segments first to get that cash flow going. Then you could broaden the system over time.
Senator, I would be happy to talk to those people. I haven't been able to find any. I've been in this business a very long time.
I'd love to have that conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to have it, because if they're there, I'm happy to talk to them. But I will tell you that I've had financed these things, been involved with them for a very long time. Japan Rail was one of my clients. I was the CEO of a Japanese bank. And by the way, I talk to Goldman Sachs all the time. I talk to Morgan Stanley. I talk to any number of foreign operators. And I haven't been, so I'm happy to say that if you got them, we clearly will deal with them.
We welcome and want private sector investment. We've not seen that model anywhere in the world. For example, when you build an airport, if the airlines would come in and, for example, subsidize Sacramento addition of a terminal, or an Orange County or additional terminal up front, that would be great. I don't think that we've seen that, but Senator, we would welcome.
You've got a $9 billion investment, and that is taxpayer money. And I'm saying you use that as the initial investment with private sector participation, with the private sector taking the risk, with you doing one segment. And I'm sure the private sector is going to say, what is the most profitable segment of high-speed rail in the state of California? And they're going to focus on that. They're going to figure out how to make that rate of return. There have been conversations that I will follow up on and see if we can engage this process. But for us to start in the Central Valley with taxpayer money where we know it's not going to be profitable, just because the money is available makes absolutely no sense to me.
Senator, let me address the one issue you raised. If we've somehow conveyed the message that we don't think that the first operational segment will be providing a net profit, then we've miscommunicated.
A net operating profit.
In a net operating profit. Because we believe it will, based on peer review, based on looking at other examples in the other 14 countries that have it.
Just to follow up that last, while you do, and I think that's, one of the things that we're discussing and appropriate, you also report, I believe, that the first the first 3 or 4 years may not be.
No, we don't. That's just it's an error, and obviously the plan isn't clear. But if you look at,
You think right from day one it'll be?
I mean, if you look at, and we say it in the plan. If you look at page 8, 4, is it 8 when we turned out? I'm sorry.
Should we?
You say that on page 5 of this, 821. If you look at 821, there's a graph.
Yeah.
And it's a very small statement under the graph, and clearly we need to make that much more clear. But if you look at that page, you will see that from the first year of operation, it has a net operating profit.
Can I just amplify on this for a second?
Yes, Dan. Richard.
I don't want to. This next statement that I'm going to make is actually one that Mr. Rossi taught me, so I just want to give the credit where it's due. But just to give you an example of why we think that's true, let's look at if we build the initial operating segment south from Merced to, say, Palmdale, something like that, and L.A. Metro is coming up to meet us there. One of the things that Mr. Rossi brought to this process was not just reviewing in detail the ridership models, including literally going to the source at the company, talking with Dr. Koppelman and his colleagues. I mean, Mr. Rossi has delved into all this and has done financial models throughout his career. But one of the things that Mike told us was that we needed to have a break-even analysis to understand. I understand when members say, well, we're not sure about the ridership numbers. That's fine. I think, our banker came in and said, I don't want to have to depend on forecasts. I want to know what the break-even numbers are. The break-even numbers are pretty startling because if you look at our forecasts, we would have, and we believe, as Chair Umberg said, that all of the inputs that went into them were selected to be as conservative, or Mike says reasonable, but they definitely were not on the optimistic side. Population, all those other things. So if you look at that and you say, our high forecast number would have to be wrong by 84% to not break even. Our mid-case number probably somewhere around 60-something%, and so forth. Even our low-case number, we could be below our low-case number by a significant fraction and still break even. And one of the things Mr. Rossi pointed out to me was if you look at the line that right now runs through the valley down to Mr. Rubio's district, the Amtrak San Joaquin line, no one, including people from Amtrak, would say that that's their most sterling level of service. It's a long slog from the Bay Area down to Bakersfield, a bus bridge from Bakersfield to Los Angeles. They just hit 1 million riders a year on that. L.A. Metrolink coming up to Palmdale is at 1.5 million. Now, in which year are we talking about, Mike? 2030 or something like that? We would need, in order to break even on that line, the initial operating segment down there, we need 2.2 million riders. There's 2.5 million in that corridor right now. Now, they're not all exactly the same.
That's in 2022.
2022.
The mid-case calls for 4,474,000 riders. The break-even calls for 2.2 million. There is existing utilization along that corridor, as Dan just said, totaling 2.5 million today. 11 years from now, we need 2.2 for break-even.
So that's one reason we believe that this thing will generate positive income on a going-forward basis from the beginning. Just a quick comment to Senator Gaines. I also look to Mr. Rossi to correct me if I'm wrong. I think where we may be having a slight disconnect, Senator, is that there's a different model of private sector involvement if the state is providing a revenue guarantee, which we can't do and don't do under Prop 1A. So I would not be surprised if you had people saying to you that if the state were to stake $9 billion of its money to provide guarantees for their revenues, that they might put up some of their dollars. But that's not what we're talking about here. If the federal government wants to talk about a different type of structure that has an availability payment or whatever, that's a different type of structure. But what you heard from Mr. Rossi was consistent with the experience that we've had around the world, which is that basically there are public dollars that build the base. The private sector comes in, buys the trains, puts in the last equipment, and operates. Now, I know everybody would like to get them in as early as possible. I understand that, Mr. Chairman, but I think we're just trying to be realistic in terms of what we see as the model. And finally, I just wanted to say, as Mr. Rossi said, we're happy to sit down with you in your office because we're not the font of all wisdom. I know this may come as a shock. But certainly if there are other ideas, we are open to them. But in fact, one of the things I think we can show you is that we have had extensive conversation with the private sector. There's a long list of companies that have come in, responded to an RFO of interest from the authority. So they're there and they're waiting. But we think it's all consistent with what Mr. Rossi said. We've got to get to a certain point before they're ready to jump.
It's also a bit of a chicken and egg conversation. The private sector is concerned about the government's commitment, that they want to make sure that whether it's state or federal government is completely, or as completely as they can be assured.
So are we.
And the government and those in government that are responsible for taxpayers' funds want to invest as little as possible, understandably, to create a system that's as efficient as possible. And so, at some point, those two lines cross.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Simitian.
Let me try and...
Then we're going to close. I think Senator Lowenthal may have one last comment, and Senator Rubio, Senator Desaulnier, and we will be getting to our second group panel soon.
I want to go to the issue of a guarantee. I recall the hearing in room 4203, Senator, when we had the conversation with the authority probably 2 years ago now about what was then the plan to provide some sort of guarantee to investors. And the question was raised, I raised it and others raised it as well, how that might be consistent with Prop 1A. Because there is, of course, the commitment, Prop 1A, that additional funds will not, public funds will not be put at risk. That this is the dollar amount flat and we're done. Do I understand then from Mr. Richards' comments earlier that the notion of a revenue, any kind of a guarantee that would involve additional public funds is no longer the case?
In this plan, there is no revenue guarantee. There is no guarantee of anything of any nature whatsoever as this draft plan stands.
All right. Well, I think that's important to call out. Then, this, and I think it's good news. The second piece is to go to Mr. Rossi's comments. I thought it was a very helpful and coherent explanation of sort of what the funding needs were, what the for the initial operating segment. But it was, as I understood it, $25 billion was predicated on federal funds, which, as you articulated it, is a relatively modest amount on an annual basis over the life of the development of the project. But nonetheless, I think we were looking
I didn't think it was, by the way, I don't think $1.7 billion is modest.
Well,
I didn't mean to mislead you in that regard, but it is less than $3+ billion.
My characterization, not yours. $1.7 billion by federal standards is modest. That being said, given the current climate, relying on, I'm a little surprised you feel comfortable relying on $25 billion in federal funds looking forward over that period of time. Is there some reason I should be more optimistic than I'm feeling at the moment about that possibility?
I'm not sure I use optimism and the situation in Washington in the same sentence, Senator, but I think we've tried to be realistic about it, and let me just point to a couple of things. First of all, in our plan, we assume no federal dollars beyond what we have today for at least the next 3 years. And the 3 years gets us to the next reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act. Frankly, it gets us past the election. A lot of the dialogue in Washington about high-speed rail seems to have been caught up in some of that on either side of the aisle. So it gets us past that point. If you look at some of the statements that were made a few weeks ago when there were big headlines heralding that the federal government is ending the high-speed rail program, Chairman Bud Schuster of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee said, well, we're ending the president's program, but we all still support high-speed rail. The fact of the matter is that there is strong bipartisan support for high-speed rail in the Congress. There has been. And we're not prepared to say that we're going to straight line from where we are today all the way into the future. I do want to say, though, because it goes to the question that you senators face about the risk, I want to call your attention to one very important part of the draft business plan. After we get past the initial construction segment, and as we're moving to an initial operating segment, we are saying very clearly in this plan that we will not go forward unless 3 conditions are met. First, that a funding plan is in place for that segment. We don't know where those funds are coming from today, but we're not going to go tripping off through the tulips without knowing where the funding is going to come from before we start. Second, we have to be confident that that leg would generate net operating profit going forward, as defined by Mr. Rossi. And third, that it would have independent utility, so that if, heaven forbid, you never were able to get anything more, you would have something of value for the people of California. So,
Which is?
Well, and if I could interrupt here for
which is an operating profitable segment. I'm saying if you had the initial operating segment.
No, you were saying no, that in the initial construction segment, we have the money.
That's right.
We do not have the money for the operating segment. So if we never get the money, we just have the construction segment, is what you're saying.
Well, what you can,
Potentially.
I was saying
use it. But you can use it,
Yeah.
and we'll also have some pretty valuable rights of way.
You've gotten to the third and final question, anticipated it, and thank you for that, which is, so, I mean, as I look out over this 30-year horizon, I look back 30 years, and I ask myself, how much has changed in the world and in the country and in the state over the last 30 years, and how well any of us could have predicted 30 years ago. I think all of you are old enough to remember when we were told we'd never see single-digit mortgage rates again. That world has rather obviously changed. Watching the up and downs of the support level for high-speed rail in Washington, D.C. over just the last 3 years, never mind over 30 years, I don't think any of us could have predicted. So I know we live in this world of unpredictability, and that's why I think it's so important that you've talked about the independent utility of segments as you go, which gets me to my third and final question. If we move forward on the plan, as I understand it, with the Central Valley component, the project is, what, 130 miles? Am I remembering that roughly?
That's correct.
130 miles. We don't end up, we spend $6 billion to do that, and then sort of take a time out and reassess where we are, as I understand the plan. So the first question, not the big question, because I think you're making the case that the big questions are sort of revisitable as we go down this on a segment-by-segment basis. So the first question we face is the proposal that's on the table for the Central Valley worth spending $6 billion on? And what do we get for that? And the $6 billion does not produce high-speed rail, as I understand it. And if it were, worse come to worse, but I think we have to anticipate this possibility, if it were the only thing that we could ever do, because the federal funds aren't there, we are going to live within our $10 billion bond measure, if that's the only thing we could ever do, and we were looking back 10 years from now and saying that's what we spent $6 billion on, we got 130 miles worth of track that's upgraded how for Amtrak to use in a way that's better how? And do we think that's worth $6 billion?
Senator, to answer your question, first of all, none of us in this room would support beginning the project if that's what our vision was. The vision was building 130 miles of track. Just like no one would have ever started the interstate highway system if they said, you know what we really want to do? So we want to build 130 miles in Missouri, and then we'll stop. If worse comes to worse, as Mr. Rossi just pointed out, we will have right-of-way so that we can continue the project later on. Just to back up for a second, Senator, you said we pause. While we're building the initial construction segment over the next 5 years, we're actually planning and seeking support funding to continue. So there is not necessarily a pause, but God forbid there should be. Then we would have a section that Amtrak could use, which would shave 45 minutes off the transit time as exists today. Again,
from where to where, please?
From roughly just north of Bakersfield to Fresno, beyond Fresno up to Merced.
So here's my question. If that's what it gives us, if we can never do anything more, based on the ridership, is it worth spending $6 billion to shave 45 minutes off the Amtrak trip from Bakersfield to Fresno? Now, I understand that may depend a little bit on where you live in the state, but that's the core question, isn't it? Is if it turns out, because we have no idea whether those federal funds will ever be forthcoming, and I think you've been smart about building that inability to predict into your plan. That being said, the first step of the plan is to spend $6 billion and for what does not deliver high-speed rail on that 130-mile corridor, and for what shaves 45 minutes off an Amtrak train that's already there, as I understand it, yes?
The route exists.
Yeah, and Amtrak's already on it.
Right.
So when I'm trying to think about what the value added for $6 billion is, the value added is that we shave 45 minutes off the train, and, in fairness, that we give ourselves the potential, if we are successful on the high-speed rail front, to use that as the backbone of the system. But that's what we get for $6 billion. Am I missing anything that we're getting for the $6 billion?
Senator, I understand your question, but that's clearly not how we think about it. We don't think about if we only build a $6 billion segment. No one would propose a project of this magnitude, just like the highway system or the aqueduct system in California, by saying, you know, we're planning for failure.
Mr. Emmerich, respectfully, you have been telling me, you personally and you, the authority, have been telling me and my colleagues for 3 years that we can feel comfortable about any expenditure if, in fact, the system does not get built out, because every expenditure will have independent utility. So I am taking you all at your word and trying to analyze what is the independent utility of $6 billion spent on 130 miles of Amtrak corridor. And again, I don't want to, with respect to Mr. Rubio and his constituents, those folks need to get from point A to point B, and I'm for them, just so Mr. Rubio can feel comfortable about that. I'm just trying to figure out if that's where we want to spend $6 billion.
And the answer to your question, Senator, is it gives us the infrastructure to continue the project in the future as population becomes more and more dense and the needs become more acute. And it provides a 45-minute reduction in travel time. Again, that's not, we're not planning for that, but that's what it gets you.
We have more.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Lamalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess to kind of start, we have a great panel. I appreciate all your thoughts and testimony here, but there's a lot of backslapping going on over, well, now we finally have an honest set of numbers to look at on cost and revised ridership. And so, I mean, there's a lot of people around here think like, well, at least now it's up front and we're being honest about it. And so this comes back to 2008 for me and what the voters were told. They're not quite as giddy about the current honesty with it, because they felt like and you ought to see the comments out there, that they've really been had on this. And so, that said, that has really nothing to do with you folks here generally, because maybe you've come into this a little later in the process. But I think there's a real problem if we're getting a little too giddy about saying, well, at least now we're honest, because going forward, there's still a lot of distrust on the figures. And I would come back to, if we're supposed to believe the 100 billion, 98.5 billion now, which has potential to still continue growing, why are we supposed to believe the figure of 170 billion on new roads, airports, things like that? I don't. And then we can go to the aside there that when you're adding to a highway system, at least that is already augmenting something that's currently there and is readily accessible to the mode of transportation that 99% of people use, is automobiles. So if you add 130 miles to I-5 through the valley of one lane on each side, that is readily usable by everybody, and as opposed to the 130 miles of a rail. Now, so let me come back to, there was a lot of discussion about the blended approach too, and in keeping with what the voters had seen or intended in 2008. The blended approach, and I understand you maybe in revising things want to link up to existing systems, but for a passenger that was thinking in 2008 when they voted for the bond of $9.95 billion, isn't that beautiful outside there?
Angels singing.
Yeah, angels are coming in. Yeah.
Apparently God is on our side.
Do I get the halo, or do you all get the halo? So, beautiful choir out there. Well, but when the voters, were they looking at a blended approach when the voter in 2008 was thinking like, well, I can get from San Francisco to LA in 2 hours and 20 minutes. that voter, that taxpayer is looking now at, I'm going to have to take 3 different trains in order to accomplish that same goal. I have to switch trains twice, and there's got to be additional time involved in doing so. But when you take the train from San Francisco to wherever the crossing over point is in South San Jose, what have you, and then ride through the valley and then jump on LA Metro at Palmdale, I guess. And so there's wait times in each, there's the speed of the train there.
I would like to
And so
speed it up a little.
it would be pretty safe to say it's probably a 3.5-hour trip. So with my previous point and this point, those are 2 things I don't think the voters had anticipated. Blended approach might make sense, but we've now lowered the sights of what the voters had expected. So how would you, if you care to, Mr. Ehrenberg, address that it's now a 3-train, 2-stop, and everybody loves transferring planes when you have to fly from here and transfer in Phoenix or this and that. But how do they feel about that?
Right, I'm sorry. Certainly when built out, we're not talking about a 3-train, 2-stop approach. But, you know, I hear your point, and I've talked to voters, stood before voters, studied voters, and the one thing I'm sure of is I don't quite understand exactly what they're thinking at the time they walk into the polling booth. I think that voters in 2008 said we want an alternate form of transportation that's been built other places in the world, that's efficient, that's environmentally sensitive, that will get me from point A to point B more quickly and more efficiently than exists right now. That's what I think. Now, I understand that you probably have a difference of opinion as to what voters were thinking at the time. But that's
I'm just going by what the voters had in front of them, what they read on the statement, and there was a certain number, a certain ridership, a certain timeline, and a certain number of trains to transfer or not, that's all.
In fairness to the authority on the blended system, Mr. Chairman and members, and I'm sorry I had to step out for a second, I think the phrase that is used in the high-speed rail plan is a 1-seat trip, and which I thought was an artful way of describing the fact that this really is not designed to be 2 systems. It is, as Mr. Richard indicated earlier, truly a blended system that integrates high-speed rail with existing 21st century Caltrain in Northern California, and I guess it's the Metrolink in Southern California. So when you arrive from wherever you arrive in San Jose, you leave your backside in that 1 seat, you look outside the window, you enjoy the time you spend there, and then the train pretty quickly keeps moving forward, and you are in 1 seat, 1 system, but you have integrated high-speed rail with the existing Caltrain system, both to avoid disruption and cost that is avoidable. That is a plus in my view. I've got other concerns.
Right. I'm going to kind of move on, and these are questions I think that the Senator could also ask.
If you don't mind, I have
Certainly
a couple more that would be for this panel, unless we're going to revisit this panel later on.
No, go on.
Okay, I appreciate your indulgence, sir.
I hope so.
And I'll try.
It's being tested.
Because it's well, there's so much, and I'm really trying to narrow.
I understand there is, but we only have 1 day.
Okay. Mr. Rossi mentioned, and what you're looking for, you know, moving beyond the previous, an operating link would mean from Merced to Palmdale, correct? And then at Palmdale you tie into the LA Metro.
An operational segment would either be from, for example, Bakersfield to San Jose, or from Merced down to the LA Basin, San Fernando Valley, wherever that would be.
Which means Palmdale, right?
Well,
more or less.
Maybe, right. More or less.
Okay. So what was said earlier about that is that this doesn't take into account the interest payments for financing, and it also assumes that building the railroad with the initial money, that's all a given as well. So it's only a net operating profit if you have the train and its interest payments already taken care of, right?
In other words, that the
You got to be careful what you're blending here.
That's what I'm asking.
Right. Fair enough. Fair enough. The initial $9 billion, the interest payments are not in the plan. Any other financing, which is discussed in the memo of the committee is not for the state, it's for the private sector. The private sector could use a series of those particular programs to finance their investment, which we in turn would be very happy for them to do, because they would do it predicated on whatever cash flows that they perceive in this operation. But it would also mean that their costs would be less, which means that we could in fact get a better discount rate on the sale of the future revenues. So that's slightly different than what you said, Senator, but the part that's absolutely correct is the fact that the $9 billion never has, as far as I know, I'm here, 8, 9 weeks, has never, the interest carry on that has never been part of the plan for high-speed rail.